All right, we should be live right now. Let's make sure we actually are. Yep, YouTube tells me we're live. Cool. It's funny how all streams end up starting like,
Is it working?
Is it working? So, today we're here to talk about all the various stuff in the news about the 1619 project, the 1776 project, the Trump's panel for promoting patriotic education, and all that kind of stuff. But before we get to the more newsworthy stuff, I figured we'd first talk about who we are and really kind of frame the discussion before we rip into the actual policy and everything. Because this is a pretty pressing issue altogether, but we need to know who we are. So I figure I'll start by saying, hey, Cypher here. I've had about a decade in the academy, and have a historian for a father and all that kind of stuff. So I've been deep into history for a long, long time. When I got my bachelor's back in 2012, I actually ended up going and substitute teaching for a little bit, and then I went back into graduate school, and I'm still in graduate school getting my PhD, but I'm also teaching again, but this time at the college level. I am teaching U.S. history, both the first and second half. First half this semester, second half next semester. So it's been kind of weird because of COVID and everything. Literally, my first semester was first semester teaching. I've been in the PhD program for like 3 years. So, that's kind of my experience. Let's move on to Grant.
Hey, well, my name is Grant. For those watching, my channel is The Casual Historian. I don't have it listed on the screen. My education is I have a bachelor's in history from a local university. Now, I would have gone to grad school, but the job market and the funding mechanisms were not ideal at the time right now, so I chose not to go.
Okay, so we already have a super chat from Goodman 4, just asking how our week's been going. It's been kind of hectic.
Man.
Yep.
Good man. It's been good, man.
Yep. Good. Actually, very stressful. Yes.
Yes. yes, it has.
First time getting a haircut since the lockdown started.
Wow.
I just do it myself.
I'm saying.
Not brave enough to do that.
You're cheating.
You call it cheating. I just call it winning faster.
So let's go on to Emperor.
I'm Emperor Tiger Star. I'm currently in my first semester of grad school now for shocking history. And I guess that's my academic credentials. I think I'm the youngest one here.
Probably.
So,
Yeah.
But it's good to have a range of perspectives.
Yeah.
And probably the most experienced is next, Matt.
Ah, yes.
Yes, I'm the elder, Mr. Beats, and
The elder statesman.
so not wisest though. Probably the least wise of the bunch, but that's okay. Yeah, I've taught for. Well, let me go back. I do have some pieces of paper. 3 pieces of paper, believe it or not. I'll be paying them off for the rest of my life. A bachelor's in journalism and another one in education, and then I have a master's in history, of course. Emperor Tiger Star. But yeah, this is my 12th year teaching in the classroom. When I first started my YouTube channel, actually, it was for my students that I was student teaching. Well, the first video I made was for my students that I was student teaching way back in the fall of 2009. So yeah, I am excited to be here, and I definitely have a lot to say about these topics. I hope I don't get fired over it. But yeah. Be careful.
Jeez, 2009.
Man.
Yeah.
I was like a sophomore in college.
Hey now.
I see. So everyone here on this panel, apparently, besides me and Matt, are just a bunch of youngins. Because I think Matt and I are the same age, if I'm not
I'm
mistaken.
not young. I'm
Yeah.
32.
All right,
We're all
compared to me,
millennials. We're all millennials.
we're all millennials, right?
Yeah.
I'm debatably Gen Z because when I look it up, they say that like millennials either end in 1996 or 1997. I was born in '96, so
Zoomers.
I'm like right on that borderline.
Just shut up.
Yeah, 2009, I was in
If you were
I was in
old-
seventh grade.
96. I was born in 1982 when everything was brown. All right? Everything was brown in the 1980s.
All the pictures
And
is what you're
Wood
talking about.
paneling, hair, all of it. All of
I
it.
can confirm that the high school that was built
back
in the
when
70s.
you had hair.
Yes. Back when
So,
I had hair, it was brown. Yes.
So, Sammy, on to you. What's
Yes.
your educational background?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sammy. I run the channel US 101. Apologies if my screen is a bit dark. I've got to work on my lighting situation in my apartment. I also hold a couple pieces of paper as well. I have also a bachelor's in journalism, like my esteemed colleague, Mr. Pete. I got mine from Rutgers University. And this past May, I just received my master's degree, master's in the art of teaching with a focus on history, American history. I received that master's degree from University of Illinois in Chicago. And I've been a teacher now for about, what time is it? About 3 weeks. I just finished my third week as a U.S. history and world studies teacher. And like Matt, it's a lot. It's pretty stressful just because of all of the things we're dealing with between remote learning. I know some people are hybrid teaching as well, which I wouldn't wish on anybody. Here in Chicago, we're fully remote right now.
Hybrid is great. That's what I'm doing, and
That's
it's
what I'm doing
easier.
too.
I know, but that's why I don't wish it on you, because the last thing I want you guys doing is getting exposed to something that you don't need to be exposed to. That's all I'm saying. But so 3 weeks being a teacher. I love it, obviously. Like, the kids are great. I'm teaching amazing subjects. I'm teaching U.S. history and world studies. I'm excited to be here tonight with a bunch of esteemed history YouTubers, some of which I'm meeting for the very first time. To which I say, gentlemen, cheers to all of you this evening. Salute. Here's hoping we have a great chat, entertaining, and hopefully people don't hate us too much by the end of this.
Thou art all gentlemen and scholars.
And
Tis true.
thank you, TY. It says primary Chuck Schumer.
I
No.
love the comments.
Oh, this is going to be a wild ride.
Let's go.
Let's first talk about what Trump actually said before commenting about our opinions on all of that. Let's just read what he actually said, because there's been a project called the 1619 Project by the New York Times that is about the basically trying to make a new curriculum that centers slavery and black voices in the curriculum rather than the predominantly white Eurocentric view that is typical in much of American education. Also, say hello to King. He's going to join us, apparently.
Hey,
buddy.
King.
Your Majesty?
And we have another one.
My cat's too loud. Can't have him.
He's trying to get at my cookies. So that's why. So the this has been seen by many as by much of the public as kind of ruining the kids. And I mean, I've even been fairly vocally critical of it, not saying that I'm opposed to it, but yes, very much critical of it, because it's the New York Times and they're doomed to sensationalize basically everything. That being said, the vitriol opposing it has now brought in the federal government, and especially with Trump, who has issued an executive order on this. But first, we have another super chat. Thank you, Jay Camacho, who says,
thank you.
"Mr. Beat is the best." Oh
I
no!
mean, he is the best. You paid $2 to tell him that he's the best?
On the Cynical Historian channel. I love it. No, thank you, though. Thank you.
So I have a few choice quotes from his public thing at Constitutional Hall, where the Constitution and Declaration of Independence are actually housed, and he stated that he wants to promote patriotic education. Before we get that, thank you, Nicholas. Oh, that's the wrong one. Nicholas Gonzalez. Well, my cat is...
It's all a sight gag. Tiger Star is just, this man is just sitting in for the real Tiger Star, who is sitting next to Sniper, trying to get their little cookies. I know what's up.
Also, thank you, Goodman 4, and and
He's like a minx. He's like a hairless wonder. Look at him.
Look at that baby face.
That's right.
I miss the beard.
What if Rivers Cuomo lived in Kansas and became a teacher?
So,
Mr. Beat.
I had the beard for like you guys for a little while. Yeah.
Did you have a video about that? And you're not growing up the beard.
Yeah.
He didn't have a beard when he did that. When he did the presidential beard thing.
Well, it was a long time ago.
So, what Trump said, to quote the man himself, is, "The left has warped, distorted, and defiled the American story with deceptions, falsehood, and lies. There is no better example than the New York Times totally discredited 1619 Project." He went on to say, "This project rewrites American history to teach our children that we were founded on the principle of oppression, not freedom. Nothing could be further from the truth. Americans' founding set in motion the unstoppable chain of events that abolished slavery, secured civil rights, defeated communism and fascism, and built the most fair, equal, and prosperous nation in human history." I make him sound a lot more articulate than he actually is. And to go a little bit deeper, he said in that same thing, the federal government, the Department of Education, does not have a role in a national curriculum. Oh, this was actually Betsy DeVos, the person who's in charge of that department, and she said curriculum is best left to the states. And basically that this panel that they put together is to advise a more patriotic education, as Trump called it. So
Got a lot to say about that.
Yeah.
we'll get
Let's go.
to actually dealing with all of that. But this is the context by which this conversation is framed. You know, we are talking very much about this specific thing, but to even get there, we need to talk about what we think, the state of education is in the U.S. There's this larger question of what history education is supposed to do. I see alternate history in here. Also, thank you, JCM Gomez. I don't even know what German MEA.
Mea culpa.
Mea culpa?
Oh, duh.
It's a new video game. It's gonna be dope.
I was reading it as an acronym. So, I'll throw it to you guys. What do you think, education is for, especially history education, and where are we right now as a nation?
Right,
Well, I guess I'll go. Maybe I should start just because I'm in the classroom so much, and this is something I'm really passionate about. And again, I don't want to get myself in trouble here, but for the last many decades, there has really been two states that have driven curriculum, and that's California and Texas. The textbooks that most social studies teachers use, including I don't know if I said this earlier, but I teach American history, American government, and economics. Actually, I teach AP U.S. history, which is kind of a whole new thing. But yeah, so we've already, when Betsy DeVos says that we should let the states decide curriculum, we already have a curriculum that's very like patriotic based, and a big part of that is the influence of Texas on the entire national curriculums. I noticed that there's a parallel between the outcry of like parents getting mad about indoctrinating our children. It started all around the time when states implemented Common Core, which were a new set of standards that were basically meant to kind of, I guess, add some flexibility to, specifically talking about social studies, add some flexibility and focus more on like historical skills. It was more skills based and less emphasis on content. And this actually left it more open for local districts and schools to actually have more control over what they wanted to focus on as far as the content. But yeah, I think a lot of what you're seeing right now with education is reactionary to the last 10 years, which, the last 10 years after Common Core was implemented, all of a sudden we're getting a flood of new resources. This corresponds with the internet, of course, because it really has only been the last 20 years where schools have been able to use the internet to give alternative perspectives about history that were not in a textbook. Think about that. Like, I was in high school in the late 1990s, so was Sammy. We remember when it was literally only the textbook that was a resource. Yeah, so I think what we've been seeing with this pushback, especially with Trump's speech, is just a culmination of this has been part of the I don't know what you want to call it, but there's this reactionary culture against this new wave of teaching. So I guess, like, my point is, like, the last 10 years has been completely new territory. For the first 100 plus years of public education, we did have a very conservative, patriotic education in this country. It was very conformist. It was very, make them good citizens, and it was indoctrination. The fact that we're just now starting to, like, get our students to think about different issues for the first time ever, that's why you're seeing these reactions. I'm going to stop and let you all chime in, but I could go on forever.
Well, I'm sure we'll have plenty of that. First of all, thank you, Jay Camacho and Ty, for the super chats. And yeah, so I don't really remember a time in which like, I was in high school in the mid 2000s. I graduated in 2006, and I think it was pretty much all by the book there too.
I mean, I can't speak to obviously what high school was like in the 2000s and stuff, but I mean, yeah, I can echo what Matt was saying about being in high school in the late 90s. My high school, I took U.S. history in the high school in 1998, 99, and I remember specifically we had the one textbook, and the majority of the textbook was a pretty traditional narrative, like founding fathers, Declaration, Constitution, blah 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 blah. The majority of the narrative is a story that is told from the perspective of progress was made in the United States, and progress was made mostly thanks to elite white gentlemen. There were stories about women. There were stories about African Americans. There were stories about Latinos. immigrants, so on and so forth. But those stories were always relegated to the very small. Remember this, Matt? Like they'd always have the very small, colorful panels on the side of the page that give you a fun fact kind of thing about those people. But you never got a full story when it came to other groups in the United States. You never really got stories about working class Americans. You never really got stories about women, people of color. And the issue with that is because that's the history that we've grown up with, it's so much harder for people to openly accept new studies, new research, and then just some people just outright don't want to accept it because they automatically believe that new studies, new research instantly comes with an agenda. They don't think that, oh, we should probably talk about these things because they are included in our history. And if we are able to actually learn about this stuff, it gives us a much bigger picture of American history. We are able to have a much wider scope of American history. Thus, we can have deeper discussions about it, and we can have deeper discussions about the skill sets it takes to learn and understand and appreciate nuance, context, things history is actually made of, instead of just learning factoids. If we want to learn factoids, you can play Trivial Pursuit or go down to your local pub to play a trivia game, and I'm sure you'll win all the gift cards and plenty of free beer. Good for you. But that's not the point of a history education, nor should that be the point of a history education.
What is the point?
To me, I believe the point is you're learning a couple things. One, you're helping students, and I'm, again, speaking as a high school teacher and learning from, and teaching students at a younger age. You want to teach them skill sets that they're going to be able to incorporate throughout their lives. You want to teach them how to be able to properly read a source. You want to be able to teach them how to differentiate what makes a credible source versus a not credible source. You want them to understand the value of a source. You want them to understand the limitations of a source. I teach in a school where we give our students an acronym. It says OPCVL. It stands for Origin, Purpose, Content, Value, Limitation. These are the 5 things that we're trying to teach our students to look for when looking at any type of source, primary source, secondary source, whether it be music, art, film. You want to teach students the skill set that goes with actually learning how to do history. You're not going to call it historiography in high school because, you know, it can get too complex in that case. But you want to give them at least the stepping stones to at least understand how to look at history, how to read history, how to understand history. And on top of that, you want to give them, like I said earlier, a wider scope of that history. Because if you simply limit their view of what happened in the United States or what happened in the world or whatever type of history you're teaching, if you limit their scope to those that were front and center in government and made progress and so on, so you exclude so much information that plays into why certain things were able to progress the way they did. So I think the point of history is to teach students skill sets to help them learn how to do history. And then in terms of content, you're trying to give them as wide of a palette as possible so that they're able to just have a much bigger scope of where they come from, why things have happened the way they happen, so that they can use that information in today's society.
So, I actually kind of think of history education, specifically in K through 12, as also much more like, I'm not saying what it should be, but what it's pretty much engineered to be, is to basically bring people into the story of America, that they have a collective story to go off of. You know, it's about making good citizens, and that's kind of what Trump is getting at. That's kind of what 1619 is getting at. You know, a lot of it is about, like, you know, what is the story we should be telling ourselves about ourselves? You know, history is the story of us. Because I also think of, like, you know, K through 12, you're inevitably going to have a pretty, like, even with these more radical stuff like 1619, you're still going to have a pretty, like, orthodox kind of triumphalist narrative. And the like, that's kind of integral to the entire system. But at the same time, it's also something that, like, I kind of find useful as, you know, in higher ed, is that, you have that triumphalist narrative that everybody can go off of. And then in higher ed, it's when we start breaking it down. It's when we start telling you, like, no, there's a lot more to this. One of the key things in my class is that I test them for historical significance, and there's absolutely no right answers there. There's plenty of wrong answers. there's no right answers. Like there's basically, if you're saying, like, we just talked about the Alien and Sedition Acts, right? And like some of the answers you could say for like the significance is like, well, it's the thing that broke the Adams presidency, brought on Jefferson. You could talk about it being significant in terms of how it's a gross violation of freedom of speech, and how that has ramifications all the way to the present. For instance, 1918 Sedition Act and things along those lines. And thank you. You're probably touching yourself right now. He's a
Emma Goldman fan. Setback History just released a video about Emma Goldman.
Yeah, Emma Goldman used to be like, I literally went to basic training with a Emma Goldman, like, all of her writings, and I left it on the drill sergeant's desk when because we weren't actually allowed to read. It sat in a freaking in a cabinet the entire time for 4 months.
Wow.
But these are there's also talking about like its political significance in terms of like what larger context do these things have. For instance, a lot of that lecture is focused on the early republic and how the early republic really was about centralizing control. Even the Jefferson administration was very much about centralizing control. Even though they talked a big game about limiting the government, they did more to expand the government than any previous administration. That's all stuff that I don't exactly expect K through 12 to get. That they're getting the kind of like, first there was Washington, he made a few mistakes, but he stepped down well. Then there was Adams, and, he made a lot of mistakes, and that's why Jefferson came in. Like, that's the simple thing of talking about it, but it's also kind of an easy, fun story that you can tell kids and kind of give them the tools to realize there's more to this than what I'm telling you.
I'm really curious here. Grant and Emperor Tiger Star, you guys are a little younger, so did you experience the same thing that we all did with history class?
Yes. What was high school like for you 2 years ago?
So, the Common Core in my state of Missouri was implemented in 2010, so that was right when I was starting high school. And I don't know how much of it was from me going from middle school to high school, but we definitely had like ways of like looking at different perspectives and sourcing. Like Sammy mentioned OPCVL. We just had OPVL. I don't know why we were missing the letter, but that I don't know. It was kind of weird. Like we were required to have like some sort of like source gauging acronym or something, and like each teacher had a different one for some reason. But at least the two teachers that I had for high school history used OPVL, and I definitely was. I at least like going through it as a student, I was kind of happy we had it, because kind of like how Cypher mentioned, like history being a part of this like grand narrative that's like a fun story for when you're younger. Like I was definitely in that camp. Like I remember I had like a book of all the presidents, and of course, it only says good things about every president and how they're all like, oh, this president was cool because he did this, and Teddy Roosevelt had a pet lion. Isn't that neat? Ignore all the awkward bad stuff. And so like, I was just at that naive age, like, wow, every president is super cool. Like, and all that stuff. And even through like like before high school. And I don't know how much of it was curriculum and how much of it was literally running out of time, but at least like in elementary and middle school, because I didn't get world history until 7th grade, and then twice in high school. Every other time was just American history, and at least for American history, they would always go through the Revolution, the Constitution. They would go through the Civil War, and then they would just somehow mysteriously run out of time right before World War One. And that's actually only as far as we ever got for like 8 to 9 years until high school. So high school with that OPVL stuff was definitely the first time that sort of like grand narrative, so to speak, was challenged, or whatever you want to call it, because we would OPVL different sources. Like I specifically remember talking about the late 1800s, like the Gilded Age, Progressive Age, all that sort of stuff, and how we had to OPVL's different sources for like Kipling's White Man's Burden, something from Dubois for like another perspective, like a muckraking article in like a newspaper.
Bite Me has a super chat that's actually pretty pertinent to answer that comes from what you're talking about. Says, can history ever be separated from the people telling it? And specifically from your perspective on since you're so close to it compared to us, can you?
I would say parts of it. I mean, it depends on like how detailed you want to be. Like if you want to treat history as just like a almost like a computer log of general events, then you could. Like 1914, this Ferdinand gets shot, World War One starts, and you can just do like a bullet point of events. But if you're wanting to look at history as like learning like the more like background causes and motivations on why certain things happened, or if you want to use history in the storytelling sense of wanting to learn from our mistakes, then obviously a bullet point list isn't the best for that. It's just like whenever you get into like upper high school and college, and all the teachers are finally like, we don't care about dates, we want to know about like your causes and motivations and stuff, because really like the only like non-personal history at the end of the day is just bullet point list with no potatoes added to the meat. So
Basically a chronicle is what you're referring to.
yeah.
A chronicle is basically date, here's the thing that happened, date, here's the thing that happened.
But even
Like,
that is made by a person, though. Like if somebody, they chose what to leave in and what to leave out. That's a huge thing.
Oh yeah, and there'd be biases too, but I'm just imagining if there was some like purely objective supercomputer and you told it like make as close as you can the history of the human race without making it personal. I just imagine a bullet point list of events would probably be as close as it could get.
But instead of hypotheticals and all that, we're talking very much about the education system here. And it matters who we've got 2 high school teachers here, and 1 college. But the like I know full well, like I put myself in a lot of these stories, especially in my second half of the class. I didn't even get to teach it this last time because of COVID, but when I get to the global war on terror, there's absolutely no way I can separate myself from that. And like that's something that is a deeply personal narrative. And like I don't even think it's good to try to separate it at that point. This is the story of us, and it matters who's the one telling it.
I think if you are able to put yourself in that narrative, because you have that firsthand knowledge, I think what that actually does is that gives so much. It makes the story that much richer. right? Because when you're talking to somebody, you're not giving like secondhand details. You know, when you're telling somebody a part of history that you actually experienced, so everyone in the country, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, whenever, when we look back on COVID and we look back on or just 2020 as a whole, just the show that this year has been so far, there's going to be like millions of stories about everything that everyone has experienced. But that's what's going to make that history that much richer, because everybody's got a story to tell. Whether you want to listen to it or not is entirely up to you.
And Elka will definitely get to your question later. We have a structure that we're going to try to adhere to a little bit.
But yeah, I think
thank you for the super chat.
Yeah, but I think if you're able to put yourself in the story from that personal perspective, I honestly think that like it's what I tend to refer to as like street level history, just because you're there, you've seen it, you understand what's happened, you become a part of it, you are etched in the annals of history as being part of this particular moment in time. And I think that just makes the story richer if you're able to have that opportunity to tell somebody that, you know?
Mm-hmm. But it's also like, you know, our personal experiences will affect how we tell stuff that we don't have personal experience in. You know, like how I talk about war is going to be vastly different compared to somebody who hasn't experienced it.
Right.
You know, and like not just like additive kind of bias like that, but there's also negative bias as well, where it's like, you know, like I can't tell you how much I end up like offhandedly making snide jabs in the classroom to lost causers because I just despise them. And so I will, because of my experience with that, I'm very much playing into my bias on that. That I know I am biased against lost causers. It's a negative bias. You know, there's positive and negative bias. There's additive and whatnot, but it's like I don't see how it's ever possible to really separate the history from the history teller.
Right.
I would rather have a plethora of different perspectives and biases put on the table together than none at all. At the end of the day,
that's what we try to do as history teachers.
Exactly. I mean, our goal is to try to provide as many perspectives as possible so that kids, like I said, get that wider picture instead of just having that one single narrative that they think everything happens through.
So Grant is the one who's kind of the outsider from the education system now. And, you know, what's your thought on you know, the goals of these of history education?
Well, I guess the context for this, aside from the basic educational background I gave at the beginning, I've got a bachelor's and whatnot, like the high school experience people were talking about. Mine may have been a bit different than yours. For one, I'm in California. I'm in one of those two big states where that create all the curriculum, for one. And the fact that I was going to school in what was, at least at the time, one of the 3 poorest counties in the United States. So the situation the school was in was a little different in that there wasn't, I think, too much experimentation when it came to teaching. It very much was strict textbook, especially because this was, I graduated in 2009, so that was the latter half of the No Child Left Behind years. And so many schools, especially poorer ones in poor areas, were kind of tied to following the No Child Left Behind standards because they were dependent upon that money to keep things running properly. And so there wasn't too much straying outside of the textbook unless you were in a advanced placement course, in which case you basically had the entire last month of the school year to do whatever the teacher wanted because they all took their AP courses a month before the school year ended. And I'd say I am a bit more sympathetic to the narrative you hear, like what Mr. B referred to as the reactionaries against the education system. I'm a little more sympathetic to it because I find like a lot of the complaints social conservatives have against sort of that kind of stuff, it's mostly a reaction to what they hear or see going on in California. It's like all the problems they have are mostly California centric. You know, like drag queen story hour, California thing, or like Common Core, that was, you know, a big hullabaloo about that out here. And I'd say the thing that makes me most sympathetic towards it is just the fact that there is a kind of truth to the matter. Like, the reason a lot of these parents probably think that the schools are indoctrinating their children in this is that, like, look at the political affiliation of teachers. There have been a number of studies about this, but one is basically saying that over 90% of teachers in K through 12 schools are registered Democrats. Over 90% of all money given by teacher unions for political campaigns go to Democrats. And in universities, the numbers get even worse. And so what a lot of these people see here is that, well, I'm paying for my kid to be indoctrinated in a viewpoint of the world that does not fall in line with what I believe or what I think should be of the world. And so they see it sort of being hit twice. You know, it's like you're paying for your own kid to be indoctrinated against your own beliefs. And I think that is something that people don't really take into strong enough consideration in the feelings that they're having, especially especially the university level is probably where they feel this the worst, is that they'll send their kid off to university at the end of summer, and then when their kid comes back for Thanksgiving, they're suddenly saying, you know, America's the worst place in the world. It's just a cis, hetero, patriarchal, capitalist, imperialist people that wants to kill brown people. And they're thinking, I didn't teach my kids that. They weren't thinking that before they left. So what happened? And so I think there's this weird thing where teachers simultaneously want to think that, oh, we are super important to the lives of the kids. We help, you know, we help nurture and grow them. We help the way they think. But they also don't want to take any blame for that kind of stuff. So I think that's a frustration they have. It's like they simultaneously want to be important, but not responsible for the negative stuff. But that's what I'm saying is the perspective coming from the people who are more sympathetic to what the president is saying here, or what he's trying to say.
And thank you, Devin, for the super chat. And apparently was just going to Kansas himself, where Mr. Beat is from.
Yeah, I know. I know Devin. Hey, Devin.
Also, thank you, Long Battalion. What would you like to change in? Well, we are definitely going to get to that question.
Yeah.
But you know, this conception of indoctrination bears a bit more delving into, because especially like I hear a lot of people throw that word around pretty badly. You know, it's basically anything that's taught to somebody that I don't like is indoctrination to a lot of people. But there's an actual definition to it. And let me hold on.
Yeah,
I believe it has something to do with being taught to believe in something uncritically. Yeah, the main part of that is uncritically.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I don't know if you can really call even the more blatantly kind of triumphal education, you know, that orthodox education that Trump, for instance, is calling for, that I don't even know if you can really call that indoctrination. So what do you guys think? What's is education indoctrination, or is it supposed to be?
Well, I don't necessarily think it's indoctrination as it is now, or even as the president might want it to be. And I think when people are talking about, you know, we hear liberal indoctrination, progressive indoctrination, or insert whatever word we're using to describe the political left indoctrination, what they're really talking about, or at least I think we need to sort of reconceptualize it, not necessarily as a conspiracy theory. Like, think of it similar to sort of defund the police from BLM. Some of them mean it literally. Defund the police, reduce their operating budget to zero, and, you know, get rid of them. Others simply mean reform the police, divert some funding towards other programs. But when some people...
That's literally something Ty just said in Super Chat.
Yeah, so once again, depending on who you're talking to with BLM, it means one of those things. And I'd say you need to conceptualize liberal indoctrination, quote unquote, in similarly. Some people mean it in some conspiracy theory way, but I think what most of them are actually referring to is kind of what I got at before, and that is they perceive a systemic political bias within the public educational system. It's like when 90% of all teachers are affiliated with one political party, if you're not in that party, you're going to feel kind of like you might be, well, you're literally in the minority there, or at least that's what it makes you feel like.
See, I deal with this regularly. I teach in a very conservative small town in Kansas, and so I get parents that complain. They think that us teachers are all liberal, and I personally, if those of you watching, me, I'm definitely not anywhere on the political spectrum that makes any sense. But yeah, 2 points here, really quick in response to those that kind of inclination. First, don't insult our kids. Our kids are smarter than that. Okay, they're smarter. This is the smartest generation that has ever existed of human beings. I don't say that lightly. I've thought about this a lot. We make fun of younger kids like, oh, they don't know history or whatever. No, they can critically think. And to assume that when we see these kids like in class for, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours a week, and that we are somehow brainwashing them into thinking what we want them to believe is frankly ridiculous. They spend most of their time with their families. And so I think the root of what you're seeing with pushback from parents oftentimes is like, oh, it's out of my control, which means I no longer can control what they think. They're hearing other ideas. And I was raised in a very conservative household. There were a lot of things I didn't learn until I got to college. And my high school was also, very similar demographic to where I teach now. So I felt like I was kind of behind because I was like, I had to catch up with all these different viewpoints. And I'm still catching up as a 38-year-old man. So I think it's a disservice to assume that these kids would be so easily manipulated by high school teachers. And not only that, if you've ever been in class, none of these parents actually go into the classroom and actually, if they were to step inside the classroom, they would quickly realize, oh, this is nothing what I thought it was. Most of it is literally skills based. Like my AP US history, so much of it is just can you critically analyze a source? Can you contextualize? Can you make connections from these events? Can you describe the causes and effects? It's stuff that bores our kids, most of them. so to assume that we can simultaneously bore our kids but also indoctrinate them does not jive. So yeah.
Yeah,
I would agree, and also have to point out from the college perspective, one of the key things that I am dealing with is trying to basically teach them to think about history in a way that they will go and figure out more on their own, right? That's a good chunk of what I do. That's literally, if I have any of my students on this stream, figure out you need to learn what historical significance is. That's not my answer to historical significance, and I certainly won't dock anybody if they answer in a way that I dislike. In fact, I probably actually give them more because it shows that they're thinking for themselves, and that's a good chunk of what I want out of them. It's because the main thrust of the class is historical significance, and I keep on repeating the whole history is the story of us. Why are we here? What are we doing here? Why do these things that I'm talking about matter? These are things that they can answer on their own, and if that's called indoctrination, I don't even know what indoctrination is, because that's certainly nowhere close to the actual definition.
I'm gonna jump on one of Matt's points. Smooth transition, nice. I'm gonna jump on one of Matt's points when I agree with him again. Having had I mean, a very, very, very limited experience right now being a teacher. However, I can also say with confidence that this generation is one of, if not the smartest generation. And it's not just because of, like hanging out with their families and so on and so forth. This is the most technologically savvy generation in history, period. And if you're worried about, as a parent, if you're worried about indoctrination, if you're worried about my child is getting only this type of information, before you look in the classroom,
Look in your closet.
look in your look on your kid's phone. All you have to do is look no further than TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, Facebook.
I just want to interrupt real quick.
Yeah.
Because the 10,000 is actually another YouTube channel.
Hey.
And he has come up with the most brilliant solution of them all. Just get rid of education.
Yeah.
The moon landing was shot in an LA studio. Stanley Kubrick did the whole thing. We know it.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess
So-
I'd like to make...
So, Sammy was still in the middle of something.
No,
there.
it's okay. I mean, all I'm saying is if parents are like more worried about indoctrination coming from the classroom, like we're gonna turn their kids into, bleeding heart snowflake liberals, the first thing they should do is like tell your kid, let me see your phone. Because these kids have access to so many different sources of information that they could just literally then make a TikTok video about and just spout off any information that they found. Our job then as history teachers, history educators, is to help them sift through all the sources that are now available, millions of sources that could just pop up on their phone, and help them to discern what source is much more critical, what source is going to give them more value, and then which source is going to be that much more limiting to their true to their knowledge and to how they're teaching themselves.
Did we lose Grant?
Oh no,
We did.
let me pour one out.
oh, here
pour
he
one
is.
out for him.
Yep.
Oh, there.
Yeah,
Hey, bud.
something weird happened on my end.
Hey,
Oh,
you're
well, it's on
louder.
now.
You're louder.
All right, now you can actually
Yeah.
insert yourself.
Yeah, sorry, something happened. Okay, so I guess the last point I'd like to make on the whole, how I was talking about, seeing things from their more sympathetic perspective of, that sounds like kids are being indoctrinated, and to say that there's nothing going on there, I think is ridiculous. But I do think these parents underestimate how much influence their kids' friends are going to play on their political perspectives. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I knew growing up who decided to abandon their religion because they made a gay friend in high school or college and decided, I can't be religious and have a gay friend at the same time. And so they decided to abandon their religion instead of, finding a way to make both fit into their lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's really important that we don't just underestimate that we say that students have their own ability to think, but also it does matter what is being said in the classroom, right? Like not just that, there is absolutely a liberal bias in the classroom through K through 12. By the way, registered Democrats in history college classrooms, according to the most recent study I've read, which is in 2018, was actually only 70%. So apparently less than the general the K through 12. But of course, how many of those are leftists who don't want to register with either party? There's a open question on that, but at the same time, I think at the college level, yes, you're going to absolutely find a liberal bias, if not further to the left. But thank you again for the super chat. Professing one's political affiliation in class is illegal here in Germany. Oh, didn't know that.
Wow.
Would that be imaginable in the U.S.? No, that would be
No.
a severe. That would be a severe infringement on free speech. that would
Although I
that would
don't,
just not be okay in the U.S.
that's not something I ever do with my students. Is I never tell them who I'm going to vote for or what political
Oh.
affiliations I have with, I think
I've seen a meme going around on Facebook that's actually kind of pertinent to this. Is that there is this idea that like the best teachers are the ones that you don't know their political affiliation.
definitely.
Yes,
Mhm.
100%. And being the most recent high school student, this is where I'm going to take Mr. Beat's words and decide that I'm Gen Z instead of millennial, just to say, yes, we are the smartest generation. I appreciate it. But,
There you go.
But I will say, in regards to kind of like how Mr. Beat said, like, don't underestimate like the student's ability to both perceive a bias and have their own opinions. That was 100% true. Because the area I live is in a very Republican area, but because my high school was kind of downtown, I would say the political affiliation of the students was relatively even as it could be, and relatively same with the teachers. And even though the teachers were required to curtail their bias, kind of like how Cypher mentioned, how he'll sometimes like insert his own experiences and biases whenever talking about the war on terror. Of course, the teachers would do that too, and the students were well aware to the point to where there was a running joke where all the Republican students called this one female history teacher Mrs. Clinton, and then all the Democrats called this other history teacher Mr. Nugent. And that was kind of like, like we knew, like, and the idea that like the teachers were going to like somehow like indoctrinate us in those sort of things was very laughably small. And like I would agree that like the teachers whose political affiliation was not obvious ended up being the favorites of most of the students. And I think the other factor in regards to so-called indoctrination that people overlook is that while it's different per state, teachers are often limited on what they can teach because of state-imposed or local-imposed restrictions or curriculums, like guidelines and standards. For example, in the city I live in, the only requirements to be on a school board is that you have to be at least 24 and a citizen. No educational experience or previous held job in such a field. And so it's really easy for, certain states for someone of either political party to, take up a position on a school board where they're not required to have any teaching experience or professional experience and implement their biases that way. And in some cases, like teachers may not be allowed to teach certain things or may be required to teach certain things based on that sort of thing. So it's not even always the teacher's fault to begin with.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to bring up. I wanted to bring up the curriculum.
By the way, just because you're sorry to interrupt you there, but you're probably touching yourself right now. But says that most teachers in Germany are state employees. That's actually the same in the United States. That's what Emperor Tiger Star is referring to when he's saying that there's certain limitations in what the teachers are allowed to even talk about. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I also will add that, students are a captive audience, so we do have to be very careful and professional about how we present information just in general. That's how we're trained. But yeah, one question I wanted to ask all of you all, because we need to also focus on curriculums because those are set by governments, whether it be local governments or even nationwide initiatives. Which events really, how do you know which events to focus on when you're designing a curriculum for, like, say, since three of us teach American history, how would you prioritize what to keep in the curriculum for an American history class when you only got so much time to teach? It's a huge thing.
I mean, so again, being a brand new teacher to high school, I'm obviously still learning the ropes. I can't 100% comment on this, at least not until having had a year of teaching under my belt. But having looked at the curriculum that we have in our school that I teach at, so it's not necessarily taught chronologically, but we go with a thematic aspect. So what we do to start off is we establish a basic timeline for students. So we'll start with Native Americans, work our way up to the Civil War, work our way to World War I, World War II, civil rights, and then up to present day. Our goal now is to actually literally work our students all the way up to this upcoming election, just so that we've covered as much as possible just for this first unit. But following this unit, once we've established a basic timeline of American history for context, for contextual purposes, after that we go into everything thematically. So the good thing I see about creating a curriculum that is more thematic than chronological is that you're able then to not only like cherry pick or pick the specific events and things that you want to talk about, but you're also able to show kids, I think, in a much better way how to synthesize events and how to have them tie events from one thing to another. So it's not as if like you're just giving them segmented moments in American history and you're putting them in each individual box. Like you're literally taking away all borders. You're giving them one overarching idea to work with, and then giving them that content to help them tie everything together so that the discussion becomes more robust. There can be proper debate. You can give them that many more sources to work with because you're not just working within one particular era or one particular time period of American history. Once I get through my first year of teaching, obviously I'll have a much more grounded understanding of what curriculum is like here in Chicago and how we do it at the school that I teach at. But the way I see it now, in terms of how we're going about or trying to teach the students thematically, it seems the best way, just because everything seems to flow that much easier. And once again, you're able to give them that bigger picture, and you're able to allow them to use numerous sources. We don't use a textbook in our class at all. There's no textbook for the class. So
same here, actually. I literally don't. Hold on. I literally have. Since I'm doing lectures digitally, I took away the textbook altogether, and it's all primary sources. So that's even at the college level.
Yeah. But I think that's the best way to do it, though, because if you're able to expose them to that many more sources, and then you're able to actually have them work on synthesizing and collecting data so that they can so that they can tie everything together, ultimately that just helps to make them better. I'm not going to call them historians in high school, but at least it helps them solidify that skill set that we're trying to teach them, so that they can apply that skill set not just to historical sources, but again, to things that they're just reading in general in their daily lives, whether that be like news sites or whether that be entertainment sites or whatever the case may be.
So I'm actually hold on. Let me there's the button. I'm actually in the midst of writing my lectures for my class right now, because in college you have basically complete free will to design the curriculum however you want. You'll find some history teachers that some U.S. history classes will focus on like key events or key figures, or things like that. Or in my case, I'm much more thematic, and I figured I'd pull up, because since I'm literally in the process of writing these things right now, I believe there is a screen share function. Yes. So
See if it
hold on.
works.
There
It works. Oh, wow.
Fancy.
Oh,
Fancy.
What a
So
sexy
first-
drive you got there.
So first of all, to answer Tyler's question there, Howard Zinn, E.P. Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm, and Marcus Rediker are all famous Marxist historians, and only one of them actually wrote a textbook. So Howard Zinn is definitely something we will be getting to. But the other ones are just historians writing history. So no, writing history is not indoctrination ever.
Also, I'd like to add that they are actually historical materialists, not Marxists, and that is an important distinction.
How do I get it to go? Wait, there we go. With this, like you can see, most of it is kind of thematically based. That each one does kind of have a specific time frame,
Right.
but like the New World is actually called like Europe Comes to America,
Right.
and you can see each one has its specific theming and all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Actually, that Reconstruction one is taken from my first half, but I haven't reworked it yet. Like, I've only got 2 weeks left of lectures to write. But literally finished the sectional crisis today. And, part of it is I am figuring it out on my own, what I want to talk about. These are the notes. I won't show the slides because they've got like my class number and whatnot on them. But you can see there's like I literally just have a crap ton of information in my notes, and then I just kind of make up like there's obviously a story here, and if you saw the slides, you'd see each one of these bullet points that actually correspond with a specific thing. For instance, this right here specifically refers to like the dissolution of the Whig Party. But like the you can see that like I have like all the facts, and then I tell a story. And so that's kind of how I figure it out, is that I just kind of go and like, what are the key things that refer to the sectional crisis, and then I try to build a story. And there's several layers to this, obviously.
But see, how much more freeing is that? The fact that you're not working within specific parameters of, I mean, I know you're like basing all of your lectures on specific eras. I understand that. But because you're working thematically, like you don't have to set yourself within a specific parameter in terms of the general ideas that you're discussing. You're able to make it ebb and flow that much smoother. And there's, to me, I feel like it would be much easier then to tie these lectures to each other, so that when you're presenting the larger themes, the general ideas that you want your students to take away, you're giving them more room to play, right? You're not necessarily giving them chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Like, no, like this is just an ongoing thing. That is what history is. It's an ongoing story that we continue to tell literally every single day. And with every single day that passes, things that have happened in our past can apply to what's going on today in one way or another. So the beauty of working thematically, Matt, I don't know if you teach this way in your classes. And then I don't know if Tiger Star is learning this way in grad school. But to me, thematically seems to be the best way to be able to look at history, because you're looking not just at an era within a specific, like from start to end, but you're looking at the wider picture. You're looking at the bigger story. And if history is a story of us, it shouldn't necessarily be told from chapter 1 to chapter whatever. It should be told in the idea of larger themes, larger scopes, because that helps us to take in that much more of the story, and we're introduced to so many more players and so many more different ideas and so many more perspectives.
Yeah, I taught thematically when I used to teach world history. I taught this unit we're going to look at autocracies, or this one we're going to look at human migration, and this one disease, and then the curriculum's so massive with world history generally anyway, it worked out pretty well. But I also teach economics and government, and it's thematic because it's really easy to make it thematic. We don't have to go chronologically,
right?
And I can shift things around easily. But yeah, I think sometimes the challenge with American history or any history class is like, you do want to have a narrative, and it does seem natural to go chronologically. And I think you can still make it work with themes as long as you reinforce them consistently for each unit. But yeah.
So I think we have a perfect super chat to transition to kind of because most of this has been framing the discussion, right? Now it's time to start talking about actual curriculum. So Big Beer asks, do you guys think that teaching Euro-American centric viewpoints as opposed to more African/Eastern centric viewpoints are kind of fanning the historical teaching debate? And this brings us right to our next question, which is, what are our thoughts on the 1619 project?
Uh, I think, like, in regards to, like, fanning the debate, I forget where I heard this from, but someone told me that, like, looking at it from their perspective of like the older generations, that because we're more open to talking about more diverse things, for lack of a better term, it seems like it's being imposed on them just because the quote unquote monopoly that they had is being taken away, even though it's really just, catching up to reality, which is why, like, I'm sympathetic to stuff like the 1619 project, because there is that sense of the history of teaching of the United States. It has not focused enough on African Americans. But I also think that this sometimes leads to the problem of, like, people, I guess, like, trying, almost like they're trying to catch up too quickly, and they kind of overdo it sometimes. And I think it's just more of, we're in a very, like, difficult time of, like, trying to figure out, like, what's a good, like, balancing point. And I think the 1619 project is probably an example of, they're trying to do the right thing. I like the general idea, but I can understand why people have problems with, especially with some of the framing that they have.
Well, first there's God, I have to manually do all the freaking transitions. So the one of the things about the whole idea of, like, the pendulum swing, right? We're talking about where it's like the it used to be very orthodox, white men did cool things, and now it's like, let's look at these, like, I've seen it a lot where it's like, let's talk about this obscure African American person who's, like, not really changed anything, just kind of a cool figure, like, you'll see, I can't think of any at the top of my head to even name, but when you're talking about, like, a lot of the earlier stuff is just like, here's one president, here's another president, they're all white guys, at least until our last president, but they're basically just all a series of white guys, and that's kind of how the whole thing moves. But the problem with things like the 1619 project that a lot of people see is that it's swung the pendulum too far. And Howard Zinn actually had an entire saying for that, is like, you need to swing the pendulum far enough to correct it.
I think, just to clarify, for those people that still don't know what the 1619 Project is, I know it was a big deal when it came out, but for those of the people that don't know, it was a collection of historical essays, studies, additional research done by different historians, different journalists, all basically bringing to light, in honor of the 400th anniversary of the first Africans being brought to the British colonies as enslaved people. So it was a series of essays that was created by the New York Times, put in New York Times Magazine, highlighting different eras of American history where Black Americans played a role that will never really be discussed in traditional narratives of American history. So just so that we're clear as to what the 1619 Project is. For me, looking at the 1619 Project and as historical sources, as historical curriculum, I'm not entirely against it. And I say that because, again, I went to high school during a time when the textbooks that we were given, you never saw these stories at all, right? These were things that you never heard about. And on top of that, you're hearing about different parts of American history that still have to do with white men doing things, but it's being presented to us from a completely different perspective that includes the Black American experience. Case in point, there's an essay that was written by a historian named Kevin Cruz, who, if you follow him on Twitter, he's all over the place. He's blown up right now. He's a historian from Princeton University, and he wrote about the interstate highways that travel through Atlanta, Georgia, and how those highways also serve kind of like as a barrier between white Atlanta and Black Atlanta and the economic differences therein. And to somebody that would never think of how Eisenhower's Interstate Act, which created all the major highways across the country and stuff like that, you wouldn't think of it in terms of where are these highways running through? Who benefits from having specific off ramps going to specific parts of specific cities and stuff like that? So I appreciate that it helps to provide just that different perspective. I'm not saying that the 1619 Project is necessarily gospel, but I think to dismiss it outright and to say that it's just, it's additional propaganda that's trying to teach our kids to hate America because we're built on a foundation of racism. Well, it's not entirely incorrect when you say something like that. I mean, if you just look at your history, I mean, you'll notice that in terms of enslaved Africans and some of the first Africans that were brought to the United States. And then if you look at the Constitution itself, the same place where Trump made his speech about patriotic education, Constitution Hall, in the Constitution, if he read it, he would see there's a clause called the 3/5 clause, which refers to people that are enslaved as only 3/5 of a person. So
there's a thing on that a lot of people get wrong, is that it doesn't refer to slaves as 3/5 of a person. It refers to slaves as being counted as 3/5 of a person for Southern votes.
Right.
It's the Southerners, the actual slaveholders, campaigned to have them count as a full thing. That was actually them being counted as 3/5 was actually anti-slavery.
Okay. So no, I apologize. That's my mistake. But my point is in introducing this 1619 Project as a resource, I definitely think it helps to open up eyes in terms of being able to look at our history again from a different vantage point, one that many white Americans will have never probably looked at our history from, and hopefully it helps to just give them an opportunity to explore history from different vantage points to help them realize that, history is not just our traditional elite white man narrative, but there's so many other cast members in this story that if you give them a chance to be in that spotlight, you'll get so much more out of the history that you're trying to study.
Yeah, I think it's also important to point out some of the faults that 1619 have been labeled as. One of the things that they, and in fact, Bite Me was kind of alluding to that here. And these usernames don't make transitions very easily. But he says, do you think the 1619 Project is itself leaving out parts of history for the sake of shining a light on the Black experience in the U.S.? And that is absolutely the case. Oftentimes when you when you shine a spotlight somewhere, you have to shine it somewhere, leaving other things out. That's what we were talking about earlier. But 1619 has been heavily criticized for how at least the initial essay, they have done some retractions. And in fact, the lady, I forgot the name of the lady who wrote it.
Nicole Hannah Jones.
Nicole Hannah Jones.
Right.
Yeah, the New York Times has basically been memory holing the whole origin of the 1619 Project for the last week, trying to say, we weren't trying to say 1619 was the real founding. That's what they did say.
That's absolutely what they said. In fact, she got a Pulitzer Prize for it, and it is literally the first time in the history of the Pulitzers that somebody got a Pulitzer for an article that had a retraction on it.
Wow.
First time ever.
That's crazy.
I didn't even know that.
I didn't even know it was pronounced Pulitzer. I thought it was Pulitzer.
No, it's Joseph Pulitzer.
Am I
He-
saying it wrong?
He's from California.
I mean, no, you're probably right, but I just never heard of that one.
Joseph
know.
Pulitzer was his name.
I don't know. I've just heard it Pulitzer.
Carnegie or Carnegie? I don't know.
Also, I like how
I know it's supposed to be
as-
Carnegie, but it's Carnegie.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be John C. Fremont. I mean, it's supposed to be Fremont, but it's Fremont.
Fremont, yeah. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Emperor.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I like how even though like I'm really bad at like taking my thoughts and saying them in proper words, and I like how like everything Sammy said is what I think one day, and then like Cypher is what I'll think like directly the next day, and then in my head it's like, yes, I see why people have problems, but I also see why people like it.
Cognitive dissonance. Yeah.
Well,
Hey,
and
you
one
want-
of the things that I'd like to
Oh.
point out before we
question.
move on to something, though this is a great question, that what I was getting at with the 1619 project and one of its primary failures is how it has tried to recontextualize the revolution, and that as actually what they retracted.
yeah.
Is that they said that the American Revolution was fought primarily to preserve slavery, which
Yeah.
I don't think there's any historians
is-
who advised on that who actually agreed with that statement, and there's a reason why they have retracted it. But this is actually the kind of sensationalism. You know, there's a great deal of important stuff that they're bringing up. You know, like Dunmore's proclamation, which is the if a slave comes and joins the Virginia loyalists, then they'll be freed, and that's kind of the tipping point on Virginia turning to the Patriots and wanting independence. And of course, Virginia was the driving force behind a lot of the actual Declaration. So it's not like fighting to preserve slavery isn't actually part of this. Somebody had
Well-
said in the comments earlier that slavery had nothing to do with the revolution. It absolutely did.
Well, I'd say it had something to do with it, but it wasn't nearly as clean as the 1619 project, or many people want to
That's
make it
precisely
sound.
it.
Like the order for his slaves who escaped their master can join the British Army. That was only for the slaves of rebels. Loyalist slaves weren't given that option. They had to stay with their masters. And also just the fact, like the Declaration of Independence, I haven't read it in a while, but I'm pretty sure it's pretty silent on slavery itself. And then, of course, an earlier draft condemned the slave trade. So, it's a little more complicated than just saying it was for or against slavery on the American half.
Right.
Well, it's condemned slavery by blaming it on King George.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't know if that really counts as being truly anti-slavery. It basically says something like, "And King George has forced slavery upon us."
Right.
And it's like, what?
Like,
Referred to him as the Jefferson trying to get a job, and they're calling him, you would force slavery upon us, yet you call yourself the good Christian king. How dare you? I'm like, ooh, burn, TJ. Well played. All right.
You could
All
almost
right.
cynically view it as just like a tariff on slavery instead of actually like abolishing slavery.
Yeah, but in terms of the 1619 project, we could see it's a lot more complicated than what they were saying, and to the point that it's kind of pure sensationalism at that point to what they had originally said. Once again, they have retracted it now, so there's some changes, and I haven't read it in like a month, but
Yeah,
the
I think the
retraction
big
came
issue-
about a month ago.
Yeah, so a big issue a lot of people are having is that the New York Times is pretending that they haven't been editing their stuff with it, and I think that's what a lot of people are, at least now in the last week, online have been all sensationalist about. It's like, they're retracting their stuff without mentioning why, even though we all know why.
Yeah, but I think there's a bigger issue here. I do think it still is reactionary, a lot of the criticism originally, because people have been criticizing the 1611 project.
We're gonna get to like others' criticism soon enough. Let's stay on the 1619 project itself, though.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm talking about. Since the 1619 project first was published by the New York Times, immediately Stephen Crowder and Ben Shapiro and everybody was like, well, they're just wanting to change history and revisionist, yada, yada, yada. Well, of course, like, okay, think about this.
That's what history is.
Yeah. Well, but think about, I mean, we're all white men. And if you look at most of history taught in American history classrooms, it's white man, white man, white man, and white wealthy man, especially. And I get it. These are the people. Wealthy. These were in people. Yeah, these are people. These are people in power. And I love presidential history. That's what I'm known as on the internet, is the presidential history guy. So I eat that stuff up.
And
love your book.
Oh, thank you.
Love your book.
But so yeah, and even when you look at our money, it's dead white guys on it. And you know, so I just think about like that's a symbol almost of like that old cliche, the history is written by the victors, but also history is written by people in power. And even within a country, like the narrative has constantly been political history specifically, not the story of all of us. It's been the story of just a few privileged men. And then in recent years, they've tried to kind of sneak in, you know, token stories of, oh, here's Harriet Tubman. Here's a DBQ about Harriet Tubman. Here we're going to read today a letter by Frederick Douglass. But we still have so much to catch up with, you know, like especially Native Americans. Are you kidding me?
Oh,
like,
God.
Well, here's the education that they get these days.
That's one of the ones. That's actually one of the other main criticisms of the 1619 Project is that they constantly refer to slavery as America's original sin, which I think there's a whole demographic of people who take serious issue with that statement.
And Native Americans were enslaved before African Americans, and so like they were the first enslaved, and then they kept dying from disease. So like we got to find some indentured servants or maybe some African slaves to replace them. So yeah, there is still a lot of huge holes with our history. And I think the root of the problem with the 1619 Project is that, yes, they have a clear agenda. And like you were saying, I think that it was you, Cypher, that said this, the spotlight. That's a really good analogy because...
it wasn't mine. It was from a commenter.
Oh, okay. Well, whoever you were. Because, yeah, like it turns into this thing where you're just going to make people mad. You're like, you're just focusing on that one group when it's, you know, we're a melting pot. And I get that criticism as well. But you've got to be, I think, you got to go about it in better ways to make it more, I think, about all of us. And palatable, yeah, for those who, you know, aren't, you know, typically the type to be a little, you know, upset when they see a statue of General Lee go down, you know.
Well, that's actually a pretty good segue to our next topic, which is
like we do this for a living or something.
Because statues of Robert E. Lee going down, right? Like people are seeing this. I mean, frickin' Trump actually put out an executive order 4 months ago about protecting statues, and you know, a lot of this is in reaction to a lot of that kind of mythology being torn down. Now, absolutely, there's a lot of these kinds of anti-statue stuff. Like, for instance, they went after Grant in San Francisco, probably the one who's most responsible for emancipation. You know, now, how much of that was just some idiot kids being idiot kids? You know, It's a statue. I mean, they went after Cervantes as well, who was an actual slave. And, you know...
There's that Lincoln statue.
I tweeted out a thing because Cervantes wrote Don Quixote. And Don Quixote, you know, is famous for charging windmills. So I was like, well, clearly the protesters now are just attacking windmills. But
don't knock the windmill activists. All right, it's a very powerful lobby. I'll be damned if anyone says anything bad about that.
They might blow you away.
Oh, you know what?
There's no grain of truth to
that. But this kind of a lot of this has been focused on Southern Confederate statues, right? And the lost cause is especially prevalent part of that. Now, I've done an episode on my channel about it, and I'm sure many of the people viewing this have already seen that and probably understand what it is. We don't need to go too deep into it, but it's basically saying, the Confederacy, slavery was good for the slaves. Freaking, the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery. The North were the aggressors, and the Reconstruction was purely punitive, all of which are false, but held dearly by a lot of people. And part of that is because it was in the education system. It was part of education in the South for a century, in the North for about 50 years. So this is something that a lot of people throughout the U.S. still hold dearly because they were taught that. And what does that mean?
Well, we could also mention how there's now the 1776 project that is a reaction to the 1619 project.
The 1776 Commission.
I mean, it's constantly trying to.
The commission is separate from the 1776 project. They're actually separate. Also, we will be getting to that when we get to the whole patriotic education portion. Let's talk about what the lost cause was in the education system before this. Like, why does that matter to all of this?
Well, my point is, it's essentially it's history that is literally written to indoctrinate. It's and I'm not saying the 1776 thing is that. I haven't researched it enough, but I'm saying we have. I know historical
you could definitely say that about the lost cause, right?
Absolutely. Like, imagine all of the millions of children in the South who were taught this for decades, and even today, it's still taught in classrooms, some of the lost cause mythology. And so I feel like it's been, that's a force. I mean, you've seen the comments on your video, you've seen how, like, and that's the stuff that I think we really should be concerned about. Like, when President Trump was talking about this, like, I really wish he would have just started talking about stuff like the lost cause, and because, I mean, this is, I think, has really held us back as a nation.
That would also imply that Trump actually knows what the lost cause narrative is. So
No.
Pew, 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 pew.
there is that. I'm not going to mince words. Y'all know where I stand.
Do you think he really? We'll get to that. But
the answer is no. Okay, there. The answer is no.
I like how you're really strictly staying to the agenda. That's actually good.
Yeah.
Actually,
yeah. In terms of the lost cause, though, it was a fundamental part of hell. If you're 50 years old, you probably remember being taught the lost cause, because it was standard education throughout the U.S. from the 1950s all the way to the 1980s. Like, this, people were taught that the Civil War was a gentlemanly fight between equals, and that it was truly honorable fighting for states' rights, but there was different conceptions of states' rights, and that is just false. It's not even a difference in interpretation or something along those lines. It's the same problem when we were talking about the 1619 project, where it's the whole thing of the revolution was fought to preserve slavery is just plain false. Same thing here where it's truly false, but people were taught that for decades.
Because I think. I mean, I can't speak to why this narrative managed to worm its way into American history classrooms.
I could talk about that for hours.
I know you could. I can't speak to why it was able to worm its way and then stick around in textbooks in Georgia and Virginia and wherever else for up until the 1980s. I don't know. I feel like this is an issue where it comes back to a combination of I mean, I think we'd be naive if we don't bring up some aspect of white privilege if we're talking about the writing of history, right? The traditional, again, our traditional narrative that we've been taught is that the reason progress happens in the United States is because of white men. You manifest destiny, any type of war, any type of acquisition of land, it all is on the backs of white men. The reason we have a continental U.S., Alaska, Hawaii, all these territories, because of white men. And I think that when when the South loses the Civil War, when the Confederacy loses the Civil War, it's a blow to their ego, right? So to simply tuck tail and go home and say, well, I guess we're going to tell our future generations that, we fought a fight because we wanted to keep certain people enslaved and we lost. And so we just no, you're not going to do that. Because again, if you're living if you're a veteran of the Confederacy, if you're someone that lived with fresh memory of the Confederacy, the last thing you want to do is admit defeat to the future generation, because to them it makes you look like the white man, the white person is weak. And to say that you're weak and that, slavery was abolished, now the black man is equal and so on and so forth. You can't say that to your future generations, especially if you firmly believe that the white man is the superior race. You can't say that.
Of course, you're also really talking from a Southern perspective on that.
Right. I'm only focusing on like United Daughters of Confederacy.
Because they're absolutely integral, and there's another W labeled person who's involved, but that's very much in kind of getting it started. By the 50s, it's Northern education.
Yeah.
Well, at some point during the interwar years, there was a particular group that the UDC happened to have ties with, and they really liked white people and white robes, pointy robes.
Priests?
That came to that came to power in the 20s and were integral,
right,
in fomenting this at a national level. California had its own chapters of the Klan. New York had parades of Klansmen. Washington, D.C. had the largest Klan rally ever in 1925. Mm-hmm. This was made okay throughout the entire country over the course of a couple decades. But notice that we're perfectly fine with saying indoctrination here. Why is that?
Because their viewpoints were not critical. They were biased to begin with. Because that's how we distinguish the definition of the word, right?
Well, we also said that we acknowledge our own bias, and I openly display it in the classroom plenty of time. That's okay, but why is this not?
Well, the trick is to get them to it's how they think about the new information. I think it is a relatively recent thing where it is more, we focus more as history teachers on critical thinking, whereas even I think as late as the 1990s, when I remember being in high school, it was sit and get, it was memorize. It wasn't use the information, it was memorize.
I think I also think, and I'd love to hear Grant's perspective on this too. I just think that I think the reason that a lot of people are just so up in arms about Trump's executive order for patriotic education and why they're all of a sudden claiming indoctrination. And I myself, when I first saw it, I was immediately like, all right, here comes the Dear Leader curriculum, so to speak. But yeah, exactly. But I think to Mr. Beat's been pointing this out a lot. Matt's been pointing this out a lot. It's reactionary, and reactionary tends to be very forceful, just to basically make a point. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of us that when Trump made that executive order, like myself and like Cypher, and I'm sure millions of other people too, they were just like, what is this? Like that? Why would you? We're already teaching about the Constitution and Declaration, and we're not omitting that from the classroom. We're just asking to expand what's being taught in the classroom to provide kids with more information and to give them opportunities to engage in more critical thinking and build up on their skill set.
So what are you saying is the difference here between that and like the lost cause?
I don't know if like we can, I don't know. I really don't think we can fully make a comparison yet, obviously, because patriotic education, this executive order, whatever it is, it has not been implemented yet. We don't know what
the panel actually, the first meeting of the panel was literally directly after he gave that speech. The panel was sitting right off to the side, and then they recorded that as a separate video from it, but the White House published the video.
Okay. Well, I mean, but I'm saying though, like in terms of like the curriculum that they will want to try to push into schools is not something that's a part of like curriculums across the board yet, is what I'm saying. So we can't really compare what the effects of like whatever the 1776 project, patriotic education, is to the lost cause, because the lost cause has and that curriculum has roots in American history.
Why isn't 1619 project why is like the lost cause indoctrination and the 1619 project not?
1619 project in some ways is, I mean, it is reactionary. It does have an agenda. It's trying to, they have certain things that they want every American to absolutely know. But I think that's kind of the pendulum. I think that's kind of like I was saying earlier, they're reacting to the fact that they don't, I imagine it was a team of people. I don't know who else was involved with it, but they all figured, hey, this is we feel like this group of people that's integral to American history has been so unrepresented or unfairly represented, and so we need to have a massive thing to kind of get out there. But yeah, it's reactionary.
I think Grant's been trying to say something.
Okay, so so if the question is, like, why is, the lost cause more considered indoctrination than, say, the 1619 project, I think an obvious answer would be sort of this intersectional sort of explanation. The lost cause narrative is about a group of rich white people who owned slaves, and those are, those are more overly represented in the history, rather than in the 1619 project emphasizing the role that Africans have played. And depending on which part of the 1619 project you're looking at, it's more better or worse written, basically. So I think the intersectional understanding of it might be a bit of why we're okay with one and not as much the other.
Yeah, I can see that. I also think about it in terms of, getting back to the definition of indoctrination. It's about blindly accepting something, and that it's teaching people to believe something uncritically, right? So that uncritically part is a important part of the definition, and I think the 1619 project is not guilty of that, whereas the lost cause is, because you have to ignore so much evidence to believe it.
Yes, and I'd say the other insidious thing, and I think you talked a bit about this in your video, is the fact that there's sort of these softer versions of the lost cause. You don't have to be flagrant supporting of the Confederacy, because there's a big chunk of lost causers who focus on more of sort of the atrocities of the Union, rather than any kind of fictional narrative of the just cause of the South. So that's why I'd say it's sort of somewhat insidious. Like, I would say there was a time back in especially early college years, which are the early Obama years, where I may have been actually a soft lost causer in a way. You focus on, Lincoln wanted to raise tariffs, and so he needed to keep the South in because that's where all the ports were and stuff like that. And so those kinds of things also have leached on to lost cause, which is, well, yeah, that's
we already talked about it.
Yeah, it's a bit insidious.
Yeah, but I guess I can see that's a good question, Si, for bringing that up, because both of them have already the narrative. They're what they want to focus on first, and then they gather the evidence afterwards. When as a historian, you that's not how you're supposed to go about. You're supposed to dig into
so
research.
Many historians do that, anyways. I mean, supposed to, and actuality are two different things.
I know, and we do have to mention, the two books I think that we have to mention are. I didn't see this on the notes, so I apologize if. But Howard Zinn, of course, a very influential book, a people's history of the United States, and then later another book even that I think that I read.
Here's the funny thing about that I just have to insert.
Okay.
The people's history is built off of the history of the American people by Woodrow Wilson. Just pointing that out.
Wilson. Yeah.
Seriously, the name of the book is a direct allusion to Wilson. He said so in many interviews.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But no, another book that actually I read, like when I think this was when it first came out. Like I just looked it up. It was I can't believe 13 years ago. It's a book called "Lies My Teacher Told Me."
Yeah.
Everything your American history textbook got wrong, and
Yeah.
so stuff like that. Like obviously I can understand why certain people would be really turned off by those books because it's like clearly a clear agenda. But I mean, at the same time, you have to understand why they'd be compelled to write those books and to really because there's a whole Howard Zinn still has an organization that is deeply involved with public education. Like they provide resources to teachers, and I've actually used some of the materials. And
he's dead.
No, but they have a thing called
his foundation.
Yeah, the Zen Project.
The Zen Project.
Right.
Yeah. Did I say that he was alive? Oh.
No, it's like
he lives on. His zombie.
He lives.
He lives.
must smash capitalism.
No, but it's very influential, the Zen Project, and so I think that's been kind of what you could say that's paved the way for the 1619 Project.
Also, I want to add, like, I've heard that there are rumors that some places are adding the 1619 Project to educational curriculum, and I think those are just rumors for now. Like, I haven't heard.
It's actually already taken place in a number
happening.
of places.
Is there like a certain state that's like doing it so far or anything?
Well, no state controls curriculum completely.
Well, sure, but I mean, like, is there like
it's
a
school
certain...
district to school district, and like for instance, California actually has a whole bunch. In fact, Trump tried to target them with defunding. Well, threaten them. I shouldn't say target because he actually doesn't have the power to do that. But he said he would take funds away for anyone who implemented the 1619 Project. That's actually in his announcement of this whole 1776 commission.
Oh, good for him.
But although that was actually transition again to another interesting point about the history of history education here in the United States, and that is the national standard. Just as revisionism was starting to show its head, that like Howard Zinn was being used in the classroom constantly and all that, there was a big push in the early 90s to try to standardize this. This wasn't just like the president endorsing it or anything along those lines, although both Bush and Clinton did, Bush Sr. and Clinton endorsed the project. It was actually ran by the American Historical Association, the biggest group in the country, and it was huge, just the same way that we're dealing with right now. And eventually the AHA just kind of backed off, and we continued to have this this no national standard. But the national standard was published a number of times, and it just got, especially because it had very explicit anti-lost cause stuff, and so Texas really didn't like that. And Texas, as you guys know, has a huge amount of power in terms of buying textbooks. It's basically between California and Texas who gets catered to in terms of textbooks. And at that point, Texas was still very much about the lost cause. So that this is just the 90s. Like, I was alive. Most of us here were alive. I can't remember it, but I've read books.
It was a glorious time.
But like, what does that mean? And like, are we just as Mr. Beat did today? Is history just repeating itself, or
It's rhyming. God.
Yes.
but and I gotta step away for a second, so I'm gonna let you guys keep going. But the question being, what does that mean in terms of this current fight? Is this repetition something that we can learn from?
I don't know. Like, I think like one major difference is like, because part of the reason why I was asking if like 1619 had actually been implemented anywhere, because I would say that like compared to something like the Lost Cause, and you could argue that part of it was because of the more limited interconnectivity of the country compared to now, but I felt like the fact that there is immediate criticism from all sides just right from the get-go, it compared to the Lost Cause, which was able to cement itself, like Cypher said, for 50 years in the North and 100 years in the South.
Well,
Like,
the Lost Cause certainly faced a lot of criticism when it was arising.
No, I agree, but
Birth of a Nation was heavily boycotted throughout the nation, despite it being one of the most successful movies of all time.
Like it had criticism, but like, compared to like, the age of the internet, where it's like everyone just like immediately, like from the get-go. And I just don't see like, even if the 1619 project like will be in some schools for a little while, I just don't see it being like the Lost Cause and somehow being a force for 100 years. Like, I don't think we live in that sort of time period anymore.
I don't necessarily think that the 1619 project is going to be something that is a part of curriculum for, like, as in like your entire history class for the year is going to be based on 1619 project. I don't foresee that happening anytime soon. But what I will say is, again, I'm somebody that appreciates the fact that, some of the essays from 1619 can be included in some classes. I think just to provide, maybe if you're trying to teach your students about things like deliberation or debate, and you give them two completely different sources from each other, I think that's where 1619 project can come in handy, because you're giving them a source that speaks to something entirely different from what is traditional. Do I think it's going to be like a curriculum that states or school districts implement solely as their history curriculum? No, I don't think that's going to be the case. But I think I appreciate that you can implement it in your class from time to time, just to raise awareness, to raise discussion, to raise deliberation, to raise skill set of critical thinking.
So something that bite me. God, this is the usernames.
Keep them coming, guys.
You make me have to say your username, and
I'll give someone $5 for the most creative username.
I don't know. You're probably
you will regret that request.
You're probably touching yourself right now. So,
How dare you?
bite me. So,
Yes.
How do you think U.S. decentralized education affects how history is taught when compared to more unitary states? Now, I don't really think any of us are qualified to talk about other countries, but this gets to the heart of the question about this national standard, because there was an attempt to have a national standard, and like with the 1619 stuff, as Sammy is talking about, like, people can choose whether or not, like, in the classroom, what to use and what not to use, rather than having some standard. This is how we will teach history.
Yeah. Teachers do have a lot of autonomy in their classrooms. They still, and I know that it does kind of seem like from an outsider that there's very strict national standards that every teacher has to abide by, but there's flexibility, absolutely. And I can understand, what Grant was talking about earlier with parents' concern with that freedom that teachers may have, but I just feel like teachers generally don't go into the profession to, like, with this devious plan to indoctrinate.
Indoctrinate the children.
Yeah, but
Right. A lot of teachers don't get paid enough to indoctrinate children. So
Yeah.
that's what we have our YouTube channels for.
exactly.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah,
what
so-
we're doing here, right? We're
Yeah.
indoctrinating our
Yeah.
viewers.
If it was real indoctrination, like all the teachers would be millionaires from all the lobbyist money. Like I just
Well, we should probably mention. We haven't mentioned Prussia yet. No, seriously,
we totally skipped right over that. Yeah,
Well,
sorry.
because it is relevant.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I did make a video about this a long time ago about why do we go to school, and so much of the United States public education system is influenced by what happened in Prussia, and one of the main purposes of mandatory public education in Prussia was. I hope this leads to our next point too. Is patriotic education. Like you want good citizens, you want them to conform to a national set of standards. And I think that as far as nationalism, country unity.
What was the point of the Prussian model, as it's called? What was the point of that, though?
efficient army.
Create
Learn how to
soldiers.
march in straight lines.
Get them.
We will be
smart
the
soldiers.
It's not just for soldiers, though. It's very much about factory work. Like the entirety of our education system for K to 12, it's completely different in college because people like to apply that like the Russian thing is Prussian thing is for colleges, and no, the college model goes back to the 12th century. Prussia wasn't even in existence. The first doctorate ever issued was in the 14th century. Like this is the college level is a completely different beast. But if you look at like regular education, it tends to be very much about like regimentation, standardized tasks, being able to work and labor.
Think.
But not just group thing, but like, can you pull that lever on a regular schedule?
Oh, you
have a factory bell telling you where to go, and you get a 30-minute lunch break in the middle of the day.
Mm-hmm.
It's training for a factory job, and just kind of like how Bismarck said it, iron and blood.
More importantly, training for conformity, and I think that's something that's still public education around the world. Not just, I would say everywhere you see it. We don't need no education. Yeah, but we're just now seeing a little bit of back to Gen Z. I think some of these kids they learn early on that this is all like, wait, they're just all trying to get me to behave a certain way. And I think we are seeing like a breakaway from traditional ways of teaching. Like, you think of like stereotypical desks and rows and like a teacher in the front of the room lecturing and stuff. It's because of mostly technology. It's now very much student-centered, and it's very collaborative. I mean, even with the current pandemic, it's still very like project-based, and the students are exploring and discovering things on their own. And so that's a huge shift in education. And that's why also I think I have great hope for the future, because I mean that's allowing more creativity and later on innovation.
I was going to say too, I think a lot of kids now, especially kids that are just doing remote learning, are recognizing that the traditional idea of what school is, the way we've done it in the United States, it doesn't have to be that way. Right, like we don't. Similarly, with how people that used to go to work, go to an office, now they can work from home and be just as efficient. Therefore, like the question arises: well, why do we even need an office space? Like, why are we doing all this stuff in a centralized space when we can just be just as creative and productive on our own? I think kids are starting to recognize.
I want an office so that I can put all the books that I don't want at home.
I mean, I hear you, and it's only a storage space. That's all it is, really. But I don't want an office. I want a garage. But I think that a lot of kids are starting to very quickly recognize that. Look, man, I mean, you want to try to implement this model of when we were in person online. Do you know how hard it is to look at your computer screen for 8.5 hours a day, however long the case may be, and you get 4 minutes or 4 or 5 minutes in between each class to maybe like turn your head away from the screen for 30 seconds and then go back to it, and then you're immediately right in it. And then on top of going to school for 8 hours. Then if you get homework, then you're sitting on your screen for another however many hours to just like sit and work on that. Plus you're looking at your phone all day. Like at this point, I think they're very quickly realizing they're turning us into like zombies. And so like one of the things about this pandemic, I think it very much shifts this traditional model of education. And I think there's going to be a lot of, like Matt was saying, there's a lot of creativity that's going to come out of this, not just from a pedagogical standpoint, not just from the way teachers teach, but I think from like even higher up, like just the very model of school itself, I think is going to be reassessed and even potentially reformed just based on the data we're seeing from kids doing remote learning.
Yeah, well, we had one super chat that was talking about like, interactive things. Because, one thing is everybody learns differently and all that kind of stuff. And like there's been a lot more of a movement to try to deal with that recently. I mean, Sammy, you're teaching like a ESL class, like complete ESL, right?
Yeah.
English, what's the stand for?
Well, so so in our
English
case, ELL.
language.
Yes, but we call it ELL, so English language learners. That's what they call it.
But it's people who are not fluent in English, or they're.
I have kids in my class that don't speak a word.
Yeah,
and they can't understand me. The only way that they'll be able to communicate with me in any way is by the written word. So when we're doing remote learning, I'm pretty much everything that I'm saying in that class, I'm also typing in the chat box as well, so that every student is able to stay caught up with whatever's happening in class. Otherwise, they'll just fall off like that. They'll have no clue what's going on.
That's rough. Having to type at the same time.
Yeah, it's definitely a trip. And again, especially coming in as a new teacher and not having a background, not being endorsed in EL. Look, I welcome the challenge, and I want to work with these kids, and I want to obviously do right by them and do the very best I can with them. But at the same time, without that face-to-face interaction, it's much harder to connect with these students on that level, just because there is a disconnect, right? It's so much easier to try to communicate with a person just through physical gesture, because they can see what you're doing and you can see what they're doing. If they don't get it, their body language will show in a certain way. If they have their cameras off the whole day and then they can't turn on the microphone because they can't communicate with me in English, it becomes that much harder to understand, like, okay, which student is having trouble? Which student do I need to try to connect with more? Which student do I need to modify an assignment for?
So that there's a lot to talk about in terms of COVID and all that, but that's not really
right.
Part
but
of
that's
this.
I went off on a tangent. My bad.
To kind of steer us back, like something we can talk about if we have more time, but I want to get to like the real meaty stuff that we haven't gotten to yet. Because we wanted to talk about like the science wars and No Child Left Behind and all that. Really talk about like the history of these things. But basically, we've been through this kind of nonsense before, right? The science wars were basically a bunch of academics going at each other, saying that you had like gender studies people. You had scientists publishing joke articles and gender studies stuff, and gender studies stuff is going. It was really leaning on other things. Then you also had No Child Left Behind, that tried to also create some sort of national standard by having national testing. That didn't work out. Obama actually repealed it and made it a lot more local again. We can return to those subjects again, but that brings us up to the present. And Trump. Like, we've been tap-dancing around this whole thing. What the heck is patriotic education, or is it just nonsense?
It's a buzzword that'll make Trump's supporters happy.
Agreed.
That is the most cynical way to look at it, because as someone who is on the right but isn't a big fan of Trump, you see he does this kind of thing a lot. He gives enough red meat to keep enough of his base satisfied, while the rest of us, if you chose to vote for him or not, are just holding your nose, hoping that the next justice will be worth it.
But given the context of the national standard, we didn't really get into the science wars and No Child Left Behind. But the given that context and the fact that he's absolutely attacking a particular curriculum, 1619, and he's really foisting up what is it? The Washington Post's is the one that's doing the 1776 project. It's another newspaper. It's a much more conservative one, but it's something like the Washington Post, I think, because they tend to be pretty conservative.
I find that surprising because, like, I know that like he's had like a really big beef with like Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post now.
I don't think it's the Washington Post.
Or-
That'd be the last paper that Trump would ever want to work with.
Yeah, like that doesn't sound right.
Well, it's a 1776 project that we're talking about, though.
Yeah, that's
Now they're calling it 1776 Unites, but
African American historians that have led
Yeah.
the.
well, they're very much trying to counteract that. Washington Examiner.
Yeah, big difference. Washington.
Ah.
That
makes sense.
Ooh, that is certainly not the Washington Post.
Yeah, well,
They do not have Amazon money.
That's like mixing up like The Nation and the National Review or something. Just like
but yeah. Oh god, WAPO. Duh. yeah, I screwed that one up. But the point being, he's not. It's not just him throwing red meat to his base, right? There's some heft to this.
Yeah, I think I won't try to say too much here, but it does seem like I have conversations with my dad about this. He says, why do you have to focus so much on the negative stuff? Like the Trail of Tears and the Japanese internment camps, and I'm like, well, Dad, we also focus on the positive stuff too. Like it's there's this segment of the population, and yes, Grant's right that Trump knows it. There's a lot of them that they are. It's almost apologetics of the sorts, like that, except for this doctrine of what's the word that you said earlier, Cypher? The triumphalism, is that the word?
Yeah,
that's
the more orthodox approach to history.
Yeah, it's still pervasive. I think, especially with, I hate to like categorize generations, but especially older generations they are offended. When you focus on negative stuff, and I have always been one that I love my country dearly. I love our Constitution, but I will quickly point out its flaws, and I just don't understand how you can't do both. And we should have more of these conversations where it's like it's okay to highlight mistakes that our government has made.
Yeah. Well, can you truly be a patriot if you are blind to your country's faults?
No,
No, I don't think you can.
not at all.
Yeah, I don't think so either. But
No,
like, I'm sorry. Go ahead. A lot of this does seem to be kind of like as Matt was saying, is trying to kind of plaster over the faults. But 1776 project is headed by several African American historians. They're basically just trying to reel back the 1619 project's polemics, and that's kind of what Trump is endorsing. But it's also coming from a very conservative thing. If you look at the panel that followed his speech, it's filled with, like organizations that are very clearly like, the Association of American Scholars and things like that, where it's a, blatantly ran by like the Hoover Institute and stuff like that. These very conservative positions, and like almost all the people on that. I mean, they even had Ben Carson on there for some reason.
He was awake?
Apparently he's very passionate about American history, just plastering over bits of it. But he's literally the only black man on the panel, so
If Trump is such a big fan of guys like Frederick Douglass, for example, because apparently when Trump was elected president, he said, he seems to be doing great these days. if he's such a big fan of Frederick Douglass, then he should know, being such a big fan, that Douglass is quoted as saying, in terms of defining a patriot, someone that is a lover of his country but does not excuse or rebuke its sins. And that's, and it's one of my favorite quotes, because I honestly believe that succinctly sums up what it does mean to be a patriot. You are a lover of your country. You are a lover of where you are, and you want it to succeed, but you're not going to just like smooth over those cracks. Like, you have to accept that they're there, so that you can figure out how to move forward and how to correct that, so that future generations don't have to deal with those cracks and those fissures becoming even bigger.
It's like an extreme version of like whenever like you give constructive criticism and someone takes it as an attack.
Yes.
That's basically what it is.
Yeah, agreed.
I mean, there is a point to where it seems like I remember last semester when I was having like actual face-to-face stuff. And there were points where I was kind of going like, oh, geez, because, you'd see them kind of reacting like, oh, we did that? We did what? And it's kind of like, but we did great things too. Like
peanut butter.
Like
the sub sandwich. Oh my God.
Freaking like. But
why are all of our successes food?
You gotta save the good ones for later.
Democracy.
We put a flag on the goddamn moon.
That's right.
Why.
Jimi Hendrix, man.
That's right.
I mean, the something that really bugs me on a lot of this, talking about like what's patriotic, is one is coming from a guy who who dodged the draft, and that pisses me off to no end, that this guy is willing to call history teachers, especially veteran history teachers, freaking unpatriotic when he manifestly did not serve his country.
Tell him all the way in the back, Cypher. Let him know in the back.
I think he meant losers.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I don't actually care about what he said about that kind of stuff. His actions speak louder than words.
I'm sure he didn't mean it. I'm sure it's just the bone spurs making him upset.
So, his temporary bone spurs.
Yeah.
Like,
yes.
There should never be taken allowed to be taken away from anything he talks about patriotism. No freaking way. That being said, there is absolutely points where it's like, you kind of have to sit there and wonder if you're kind of emphasizing the gory bits. I mean, after all, if it bleeds, it leads.
There's a historian by the name of Lendell Calder, and he talks about when teaching students the idea of history. He's very much a promoter of teach students to tell their story, right? And as you've been saying, Cypher, from the beginning, history is the story of us. So we want to teach kids how to tell their story. The question then becomes, since a lot of teachers, as Matt was saying, have a lot of autonomy in the classroom, which I agree, Matt, like I do, you do, Cypher, I imagine you do in your class as well. It depends really on what type of story do you want to tell. I mean, do you want to tell that glory story, that the 1776 patriotic education? Do you want to tell that gory story where we're talking about wars, we're talking about disease, we're talking about all the flaws? I mean, really, like at the end of the day, it comes down to the autonomy the teachers have, and ultimately what type of story they want to tell their students, and what type of story they want to have their students be able to tell as well.
But we don't teach them to hate either. That's the thing. Like, we don't. It's like that's, I think, what's part of indoctrination that it often is associated with. You are trying to literally teach them how to believe a certain way, and at their core, like, to make them, typically this means that, yeah, you have to, you're building a team, you're building a loyal group, and it's creating, division ultimately, because it's pushing one perspective. And I think as social studies teachers in general, our main goal is to build empathy. We want more empathy in the world, because that ultimately leads to more peaceful and prosperous times. And so
Right.
I think whenever you do try to push just one point of view, it ultimately does backfire. It sometimes takes a while before this happens. You know, we saw with the Soviet Union, it took a while. But I mean, we're still, I mean, does anybody have it completely right? I think it's so ridiculous that you go to different countries around the world, it's the same type of methods as far as how they teach history. I know I get viewers from around the world. There's some in the chat that are from outside of the United States, and yeah, you get this this nationalist flair, and there is some people in the comments were saying that nationalism and patriotism were the same thing. Well, they used to be, but not anymore. We have videos about that, and so that's where I think we all know where nationalism, where that can lead. You know, it's not a path we want to go down. And I just think that when the president talks in this way, that's what he seems to want. And that's what, unfortunately, millions of Americans are okay with that. I don't think they should be. I think we should teach our kids to have an open mind and look at different perspectives, not just one perspective. That's troublesome.
Right.
I mean, in my classroom, I often I try to have class discussions, although it's kind of difficult when you only have like 3 or 4 people in the classroom. But although sometimes it means that you end up, because I would normally have people turn and talk to each other, ask them some of the kind of questions that we're asking here, and ask them to come up with, as a group, some answers, and then just go back and forth like that. But can't do that in COVID world, but it's still, we've had like discussions about like, Enlightenment radicalism, like is what's the role of radicalism today, and like things like that. And these are conversations that are kind of deeply patriotic, right? But it's also like, for instance, on the radicalism bit, we were very much framing it with all these George Floyd protests and everything, and like that's not a conversation that I'm thrusting my viewpoint on them. I'm actually asking them for theirs, right? But at the same time, it seems like this whole patriotic education thing flies in the face of even having such discussions. Like, to me, it seems like the 1619 project is much more in the spirit of 1776 than the 1776 project, because of that rebelliousness. But at the same time, just because they get things wrong, people are willing to dismiss them and all that kind of stuff. And this is the reaction we get. I don't know, I don't know where I'm going with that.
I think we can all agree that America didn't start in 1619. It did not start in 1776. It started in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, and people keep forgetting that. My gosh.
Oh,
does diplomacy mean
or you
nothing?
could say 1789 with the ratification of the 1788 with the ratification of the Constitution.
Yeah,
the American Second
I
Republic.
prefer
Disrespect the Articles of
1791.
Confederation.
I would disrespect the Articles of Confederation all the day. No, I'm just kidding.
Or
Yeah.
something that I always find funny about the whole 1619 thing. when the Spanish legalized the African slave trade?
Wasn't it actually like in like the late 1600s?
1501.
That sounds more
Really?
like it. Yeah.
1501 is when they legalized the transatlantic slave trade. It's actually had already been being done. In fact, Columbus had shipped some himself.
That's right. That's
But-
right. We did do that.
But he did so illegally. Not exactly able to. It's not like the crown was just going. The Spanish were just going to show up on his doorstep and say, "Hey, don't do that." But the fact is, even things like the 1619 project have this much larger context that they kind of forget in focusing so much on saying this is the beginning. Although I'm probably more talking about that whole problem with superlatives, that first problem.
It happens.
Right.
Someone's trying to break into your room.
I'm Memento. Keep talking.
So it's kind of a fascinating thing to me, at least, is trying to navigate that difference between, trying to bring new perspectives, but also trying, because it's not that we should always be bringing new perspectives, in that there is an older perspective that needs to be represented in the classroom.
Yeah,
there is that older perspective that needs to be represented, but don't be afraid to add new, well-researched perspectives to add to that older perspective. Like Matt was saying, and like I've been saying, you don't want to just stick to that one narrative, that one perspective, because then you just get tunnel vision, as opposed to adding new bits and new elements to the story so that you get a much more vivid story. How is it better to look at a painting through a small tube, or like to see the entire canvas? Like, that's basically what we're talking about here at the end of the day. The goal is to try to incorporate as much of the story as we can, and then teach our students how to view that story through a critical lens, so that they are able to understand it better, and they're able to walk away knowing a bit more about nuance, a bit more about context, and they're able to apply that information to present day.
So we've been going around and around on this for a while, and covered quite a bit of not only education history and our opinions on 1619, 1776, Trump's whole thing, but I think it's time to wrap it up and everything. So let's just go around and just say what we think about, like, the state of education is, how the past affects the history of education, affects everything, how this battle between 1619 and 1776, and what the federal government's role is, especially when you have firebrands like Trump saying so. Let's start with Emperor Tiger Star.
Could be better. It'd be like
Ding, 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 ding.
like, I know this is a
Understatement of the
completely
word goes to.
Yeah,
like
right.
completely different direction than literally everything we've talked about, but I would almost even say, like, it's even more depressing that, like, you have, like, kids unable to afford lunch or use a properly working school bus. Even compared to, like, all the other problems that we've already talked about this entire hour, like, it's almost kind of depressing how much better our educational system could be, but we just severely underfund it. But I don't know. I'm a short-term pessimist, but a long-term optimist, and that's how I can contradict the thoughts in my head.
That's almost a very popular definition of cynicism. So let's go to you, Sammy.
Well, first of all, let me just say that this has been an absolute joy. It's been an honor to be able to talk with you guys and share these thoughts and ideas with each other civically, respectfully, as we try to teach our students to do when having discussion and deliberation. I think ultimately the goal, if you're going to be a history teacher, if you're going to be a social studies teacher, professor, whether it be elementary, middle, high school, or higher education, the one thing you have to do, and you have to be responsible to your students. And I think being responsible to your students is giving them the information that will help them to better understand history, knowledge in itself, moving forward once they leave your classroom. Content is one thing. Giving kids content is one thing, right? If we're using content as a basis to build on a specific skill, okay, in our case, it's history. So the content is one thing. Telling them about specific moments in American history to help them understand the bigger picture, fine. But I think at the end of the day, you are doing a disservice to your students if you do not properly educate them in terms of the skill sets of how to, and maybe at the high school level, to do history at a rudimentary level, so that they can carry those skills with them to college, so that they can actually engage in proper historiography. I think if you don't educate your kids on the skill sets that they need to do history and to understand history, to understand its context and its nuance, like I've been saying all night, you do your students a disservice. With that being said, I have nothing else to say, so I'm going to pass it on. Thank you.
And let's move on to Matt.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me on tonight. It's been great. It's like a good excuse just to hang out with you guys, and I haven't seen you for a while and talk to you. So, but yeah,
Especially in COVID world.
I know. Didn't get to see each other in person last summer, but yeah, I think in conclusion for me, I would just say you can't teach patriotism. I think that's something that just kind of comes naturally as you experience life, and I think what you can teach are skills. And I do think, to echo Sammy, I think a lot of the emphasis on content is a little exaggerated, because really ultimately a big part of what makes being a teacher so rewarding is the relationships you build with the kids and or young adults, in your case, Cypher. And so, like, I mean, yeah, what Emperor Tiger Star was mentioning with the more troubling part with, like, some of these kids not being in school and being online, not having school lunches, or they're not getting that support they need when they're not getting support at home, or what have you. I think that's actually a bigger dilemma, because I think the saving grace, the silver lining through all of this, is that because of the internet, because of the fact that most kids do learn most content outside of school, dare I say, they learn it on their own. They read books, they watch videos on YouTube. So many that are watching right now have learned most of the history they know on YouTube. So we really need to consider that as well, that whatever the president tries to do, or any other government officials or programs, initiatives, they are going to fail, because so many of these kids are getting their information from various sources anyway. You can't even try to indoctrinate them at this point. The cat is out of the bag. There's no going back, unless you shut down all the internet, which, yeah, maybe, I guess if you look at what China has done, so censorship. But yeah, I'm more positive about the future of education, and I think that ultimately, I think the kids are going to be just fine.
The kids are all right, man.
The kids are all right.
No, I want to listen to
let's go to Grant.
All right. Okay, well, I think as we've all seen here, we're never happy with education in any shape or form. No matter what, it's never to our liking. Yes, doesn't matter what political perspective you have, we all think the current system sucks, no matter what it is. I also think when it comes to teaching history, I think the big thing to avoid as much controversy or whatnot is to avoid overcorrecting every time we need to change the way we teach history. Overcorrecting leads to people wanting to overcorrect in the other direction even further, so you don't want to do that. But ultimately, I think we as history teachers and historians should blame the STEM fields for stealing all of our money back in the 90s.
Yeah.
Oh, man. I was waiting for somebody to say it.
Well, we didn't get to talk about the science wars. I kind of wanted to talk about that. Because, oh man, is there? I mean, Grant did an entire video on science fetishization, which is a real big problem. There's, but kind of off the topic here. So we've talked about let me get out my notes. we've talked about Trump's actual order. We've talked about what patriotic education means. We've talked a little bit about the history of these kinds of movements in education. and like how even like the state of education itself throughout the country, we have differing viewpoints on terms of what the purpose of history is, how biased is the field, what history teachers should do in the classroom. But I think one of the key things that we've gotten out of all of this is that ultimately the teacher has a great deal of autonomy. And so a lot of this comes down to trying to remove that teacher's autonomy. A lot of this comes down to trying to force a particular kind of education in the classroom. And King wants to join the conversation now, apparently.
Okay, I was wondering if that was your cat or mine, because like I heard
Yeah,
no.
that's- he,
Because in mine
he
too.
just he
It's
just
not
ate,
mine.
so he's announcing that he is wants some more food. But the that a lot of it comes down to like even with 1619 that they want to have like the curriculum be based on their curriculum. And I don't think most teachers are going to just wholeheartedly take that. But at the same time, it's very much about removing teacher autonomy. Going back to that thing of, textbook it's the textbook. Now we could talk about how the textbook has changed, how I should probably put it on myself. How the textbook has changed over time and that, we're no longer using the lost cause. But I'd also say that the 1619 project is definitely not only overcorrecting, but also correcting a lot of things that don't need to be corrected. That we're pretty well covering a lot of these things that they're trying to bring to light, that they're already in the light and done by much more competent professionals. That's my main criticism of 1619 is that they're basically treading on historians' territory and doing a pretty bad job of it. But the problem is you get these reactionary things that try to remove teacher autonomy in a different direction. But ultimately, it still comes down to teacher autonomy. That teachers are not getting that. So, with that being said, does anybody want to say anything more before we sign off?
Down with STEM.
Yeah.
Now, I just want to say,
that should be another live stream is talking about STEM fetishization.
I just want to say, as a governor of a small state, whenever I take away a history teacher's funds and give it to a science teacher, I feel their pain. Whenever I receive the lobbyist money from all the people in the science departments,
Bridge.
I don't feel their pain. I feel their joy. And I'm willing to reach across the aisle with mathematics and with reading and writing, and I think the American people can come together and dismember history for what it is.
Hear, hear.
Thanks, Bill.
Anytime.
Now where's
man.
that secretary?
Right. That man is. Leave
Now
that man
you-
alone.
Now you listen here, Sapphire. You can come in here with your $1,500 suit and telling me and what your cronies and what I'm doing, but you bring my secretary into this, you ought to be ashamed of your damn self.
That was too good.
I've weirdly discovered out of all the presidential impressions that I try to do, I think Clinton's like the only one that like I can do well because Arkansas is just one state below me, so it's a lot easier for me to copy that way of speaking.
Regional accent. There you go. Just jump
Yeah.
in.
Yeah. So, then without further ado, unless anybody else has something else to say, I think we had Bill Clinton in the chat for a little bit, but I think he's gone now.
There you go.
So, the point being, it is a very complex subject, and I don't think a lot of the vitriol you see on Twitter or from the president or the president on Twitter really does any of this justice, and it takes this kind of deep conversation to actually get to doing anything. But with that being said, It's time to call it good, guys. And thanks
Sounds good.
for joining me. Also, their channels are linked below in the description. If you are not subscribed to anyone here, fix that.
Although I think the link to Sammy's channel is broken.
Yes.
What?
Yeah, you got messed.
Because you had him with
Yes.
like the user / thing, but I don't think his channel's old enough, so you need like the newer URL.
Oh no!
Search-
I am
Search
so
US
sorry.
101.
Yeah,
Yeah, US 101 username right there. I will get to fixing that immediately.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
With that being said, good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Right.